Welcome to the Evolve Lactation Podcast. I'm Christine Staricka, a board-certified lactation consultant in the U.S., and I create strategic lactation education for professionals who refuse the status quo. If you are involved in supporting and advocating for breastfeeding and human lactation, meet me here on the podcast for insights and encouragement. I've had a unique career in breastfeeding support, working in multiple types of settings, and I enjoy sharing my thoughts and observations with you. This podcast is about solutions, not complaints. It's about finding ethical, resourceful ways to solve problems and continue adapting to the ever-shifting landscape in which we work and live. I've got ideas, and I welcome some incredible guests onto the show to talk about their work. Grab your favorite drink or snack and settle in as we begin this next episode of the Evolve Lactation Podcast. All right, welcome everybody back to the Evolve Lactation Podcast. I am here with this episode to talk about what I call the clinical barriers to breastfeeding. There's a lot of conversation in the US where I live about barriers to breastfeeding, and a lot of that focuses on things like societal and cultural barriers to breastfeeding. And then there's also conversation about physiological barriers to breastfeeding. So structural barriers would be things like a lack of paid leave that would allow people to earn their living while they are bonding and breastfeeding their baby when they're young, and then be able to return to their job with the protection of not losing that job in the interim, as well as being paid so that they can continue to support themselves. That would be a structural barrier. There are many others that have to do with the way that society views breastfeeding and policies and laws that are in place which either protect or support it. And there are cultural things, which a lot of that revolves around misinformation and the way that people understand how breastfeeding works, as well as things that are influenced by the commercialism of parenthood and how much stuff is marketed toward parents these days. Then there are physiological barriers, another huge part of this conversation. These are things like medical reasons why breastfeeding would be contraindicated. So we're talking about physiological things here. We're also talking about things like a lack of adequate milk production, which can sometimes be caused by physiological reasons and other times caused by misinformation and mismanagement of clinical situations. So we have those situations. We have those barriers to breastfeeding. And collectively, what we're working toward is trying to make it possible for everyone who wants to breastfeed to be able to do so, and to be able to do so exclusively should they want that. And what I've seen in my career are those structural and cultural barriers, those physiological barriers. And then I've also seen the clinical barriers to breastfeeding. That's a term I use to catch a certain set of categories that we don't talk about quite as much. And these include things like misinformation, a lack of fundamental lactation support like latch assessment, or no one actually observing a baby feeding, especially very early on in the hospital or directly after birth. The use of tools to mask breastfeeding problems, and those tools can include a lot of things like formula, pumps, shields, and lots of other devices. Pediatrician visits, which are timed in such a way that they can increase anxiety in parents and families about breastfeeding. And unqualified people providing lactation support who don't actually know what would be a red flag that requires referral to a higher level of lactation care. So we're going to talk about these 5 clinical barriers to breastfeeding in this episode. And I think that some of these things are not talked about because it's not very popular to say that sometimes certain people are getting in the way. But these are definitely things that I've observed and people around me have observed. And I've talked to, frankly, a lot of people in the lactation field in the almost 25 years that I've been here. So I do have a lot of insight coming into this. So we'll start with misinformation. Misinformation comes from a variety of sources, and we've been fighting misinformation for a really long time. But currently, we're also fighting misinformation in the form of the way that information is collected and reported online. And I'm not talking about, the mother's cousin Sue said that this is the way it is and it's not really. I'm not talking about misinformed people. I'm talking here about something that I've seen very recently, which is how the AI summaries of the answers to questions that people put into search bars and search engines, those AI summaries are terrible representations of the information that's out there online. Now, of course, we know that some of the information that's online is wrong in the first place. Some of it is too broad or too vague to actually help people, and some of it is right. But how are people supposed to know what's right and what's wrong? Well, previously, when you typed something into a search engine, you got a list of links, and you could at least tell yourself, well, if I go to this link, it comes from this place, and I believe what that place, organization, institution, person, I believe what they say because I trust them as a source. But now, the first thing that you get as a result of your question or search term is an artificial intelligence generated summary of what they have found online. Well, they may have found a proportion of information that is more wrong than right, but it's artificial intelligence. It doesn't know that. It also doesn't know anything about the situation of the person who's asking. So misinformation has actually gotten much worse. And that's a really, really terrible thing. If you don't believe me and you want to see this happen for yourself, go to a search engine that generates these AI summaries and type in, a very broad term about lactation that you think that a parent would be asking, like milk production or how to latch my baby. You are going to see some things that will raise your eyebrows. Some things that you will see will be great, and some things will be really, really not great. So this misinformation, it's just not getting better. We can continue to make sure that the information that we put out into the world is accurate. And we want to make sure that we're doing that. No matter who you are, if you are putting information out into the world verbally, if you are teaching somewhere, if you are taking care of human beings in the course of your work, if you are posting things online, don't post things that you aren't sure are accurate. If you don't know, don't guess. Find out, or don't answer it at all. You don't have to have an answer, but you have to get people to where they can get a correct answer. So that's one thing that we can do about misinformation. So our next category here is going to be a lack of fundamental lactation support, like, as I mentioned, latch assessment of feeding and sucking while in the earliest hours and days of breastfeeding. If no one who is qualified to do so is actually watching a baby breastfeed or seeing how latch is happening, things can slip through. Big problems can happen. And we all know and we all have seen that if a baby is not latching well, this can result in first pain, secondly, lack of milk transfer to the baby, and third of all, trauma to the nipples. All of those things themselves can interrupt exclusive breastfeeding right there. Any of those things happening can be the reason why exclusive breastfeeding gets interrupted. And I want to step back for a second to sort of define why we're talking about this in the first place. Exclusive breastfeeding is the physiological norm. We're not talking about feeding choice right here. We're talking about maintaining, supporting, facilitating the physiological norm. When this is interrupted, especially by something that doesn't have to result in never exclusive breastfeeding again, that is really a big problem. That is a huge barrier right there itself. But we are talking about these things in terms of whether they are a problem that interrupts exclusive breastfeeding, because it is very difficult for somebody to resume exclusive breastfeeding when they're already in this environment with all of these cultural and societal barriers and these physiological barriers and these other clinical barriers. So the goal here is to try to avoid anything that's going to interrupt exclusive breastfeeding other than medical emergency or medical need, or the breastfeeding mother says, I don't want to do that anymore. Those are the real reasons. Those are the real things that should be interrupting it, not any of this other stuff. So that's why we're talking about that. So back to our lack of fundamental lactation support, especially early on, early hours, early days of breastfeeding and lactation. If we are missing things that early on, that can lead to the problems that get in the way of people continuing to exclusively breastfeed. It's just that simple. If someone is told erroneously that a newborn needs formula for any reason that is not medically documented or medically accurate, and they give formula, you can't take it away. You can't go back on that. You can't unsee it, right? That's happened. And that exposure has consequences within the baby as well as psychologically for the mother. So there are always reasons to ensure that what we are doing, making sure that we're not potentially interfering with exclusive breastfeeding unless we have a really, really, really appropriate reason. I mean, a really strong reason. And I'm just not sure if breastfeeding's going okay from the outside of it is not a reason to tell someone to stop exclusively breastfeeding. When hospitals and birth facilities and birth attendants lack the proper training or the proper motivation to ensure that mothers are supported to exclusively breastfeed, they miss things. They are not able to see red flags that would indicate that there could be a problem, which not only potentially interrupts exclusive breastfeeding, but it puts them both at risk. It puts the mother and the baby at risk, and it puts milk production at risk. So we have a system called the Baby Friendly Hospital Initiative. We have a strategy which includes all of the ways that we can best support people in the very beginning of breastfeeding. It is not as widely implemented as it should be. It should be everywhere. It should be known by everyone. It should be used everywhere that babies are born, because it is proven over decades to include all the information and all the techniques that would support people to exclusively breastfeed. It's very simple. But since that's not the case, we need more people to have even more information and be more involved, taking the initiative to get their information, to get their training. So if you work in a facility that's not designated baby friendly, maybe it was before, but it's no longer. Maybe it never has been. Maybe your facility doesn't care, wants to do its own thing. It's your responsibility as an individual practitioner in whatever discipline you're in to ensure that you have already had appropriate lactation education for the level of care that you're providing, or that you get that. We know there is a documented lack of information provided in the formalized education system of nurses and physicians. So that means if that is you, unfortunately, where you are right now, you have to take the initiative to make sure that you are obtaining that. And I know that many, many nurses and physicians are, because they reach out and they ask questions and they enroll in courses, and they're talking to us in my other job about the education that they're getting. We can see this. We know that there are plenty of people who are being responsible and taking the initiative. And we need you to talk to your colleagues and let them know that these things are available. And we'll talk a little bit more about that at the end of this when I wrap it all up. But for now, let's move to our third category of clinical barriers to breastfeeding. And that's going to be the use of tools to mask problems. So this happens in a couple of different ways. So one of those societal barriers is, especially in the United States, where we do not have the protection of anything that pertains to the WHO code. We don't have any regulation on the marketing of any kinds of products that have to do with lactation or breastfeeding, and we have no regulation on infant formula and its marketing. So Parents are marketed to, you've heard me say this a million times, they're bombarded with marketing messages about all of these products that they supposedly need in order to breastfeed or in order to make sure that their baby is well fed. It's not just formula. It's all of the other things that these companies are telling parents that they need in order to breastfeed. And all of these things can be things that get used to mask breastfeeding problems. So sometimes what happens is that it seems easier to just tell somebody, well, you can just pump. You can just use a pump instead. And when that comment is made very early on in lactation, in the first hours, in the first days, what happens is that sometimes pumping starts and pumping simply continues because it wasn't really made clear that pumping could be a temporary thing. Sometimes it feels like pumping is easier than breastfeeding was when we were trying it and it was super hard. So sometimes people are not able to resume exclusive breastfeeding because no one really tells them that they can or supports them to do so. If it started too early and proper education about how it works is not given, that can also compromise exclusive breastfeeding and exclusive human milk feeding. It can compromise milk production. It's very detrimental to get a piece of equipment for your health care and your health behaviors and not know how to use it properly. That's really not appropriate and it's unethical. But it happens all the time. And pumps are not the only thing that gets involved here. We also have the use of formula as a tool to mask a breastfeeding problem. If we look at a situation that would come up in the earliest hours or days of breastfeeding where the baby isn't getting milk and isn't able to breastfeed well, if the only problem we solve is that the baby gets some food and we forget about the fact that we have to figure out why they couldn't breastfeed and get milk from the breast, then how in the world would we ever expect that mother to be able to resume breastfeeding? So we have all of these things, we have nipple shields, we have other kinds of devices that get used that can be just a way to temporarily fix a problem, we believe or we know, but really they end up getting used kind of forever. And we also know that sometimes when mothers use a thing or do a certain feeding routine or whatever it is that they've done with one child, they will do the same thing with their subsequent children because that feels like the most fair thing for them to do. I've talked to plenty of mothers who felt that because they had formula fed their previous children, they could not breastfeed this child because that would be unfair and they would be doing something they didn't do for their other child. And you can't blame somebody for feeling that way. It's their children, so they get to pick that. But it really does make you think, what happened those first times? Did they even get the support they needed? Would they have been able to breastfeed if they had been given the proper information and the proper support? These things really interfere in ways that people don't think about when they say things like, well, you can just pump, or you can just use formula, or you can just do this. We really have to think about where that's going. It's not a temporary thing they're going to try one time. It could end up being the thing that they do, and it could end up being the thing that they do with other children. And fundamentally, it doesn't fix the breastfeeding problem. It also doesn't ever provide them with the information they need to understand why breastfeeding was hard. If all we ever do is fix the problem of this baby is not getting enough food, we give them something else, or we get milk out of the breasts and give it to them in a bottle, and we never help the mother figure out what was difficult about feeding at the breast, she will fill in that gap with the story that feels best for her. Sometimes that can be helpful for her, but it may not be accurate. She will fill in the gaps with any information that she has and any self-blame, self-identity issues that she might have. It isn't fair to people to not help them understand what was going on in their breastfeeding situation. Why did the tool work? It isn't about changing their mind or taking them out of a path that they're in, but helping people to understand the breastfeeding problems that they're having can help them to feel better about the choices that they're making. When someone understands that they had low milk production because of a certain problem that they know about, a medical issue, a hormone dysfunction, something that they know about, they can understand that. They can explain that to other people if they choose to share that. They can remind themselves of that in the night if they're rethinking their decisions, whatever. But it isn't fair for them to not have an answer. We would never tell somebody in any other part of healthcare. We don't do that. We explain things. We say, this is your lack of whatever production that is leading to this condition. We work really, really hard to figure out what causes diseases and medical conditions and syndromes and symptoms. We work really hard to figure those things out and to make sure that patients understand what's going on in their body. And sometimes it seems like we just skip over it when it comes to breastfeeding. And that's really frustrating. And it's really not fair to mothers. So our fourth category here of clinical barriers is going to be kind of maybe specific to the United States, but for most people here, what happens if you're not in the United States and this is not the way that it works where you are, you may still recognize a pattern here that can be a bit disruptive to exclusive breastfeeding. So typically here in the United States, when a baby is born, and most babies here are born in a hospital, and they stay in the hospital for anywhere from 24 to 72 hours in typical situations. And then after that, they are generally instructed to see a medical provider, a doctor or a clinic, within about 48 hours of going home. And then they'll sometimes go back when the baby is 2 weeks old, and sometimes they'll go back when the baby is 1 month old. Sometimes those that inter time there, the 2 more weeks, the 3 more weeks until the baby's a month old, sometimes that can be so long that a breastfeeding problem gets missed. Sometimes a pediatrician visit or a health clinic visit ends up being a situation where the baby is weighed on a scale that's different from the scale they were weighed on in the hospital, and no one explains that, and there's questions about the baby's weight. There's all kinds of ways that doubt about exclusive breastfeeding gets injected at all of these appointments. Because in most situations, people are taking their babies to pediatricians' offices and clinics where there aren't any lactation trained people without specific lactation training. Now, I fully recognize there are plenty of pediatric offices where there is dedicated lactation support, but that is by no means the norm. That is not generally what happens. So there are many people who are not actually trained in exclusive breastfeeding and also in human lactation and the maintenance of milk production, who are giving out information that pertains to breastfeeding and milk production that is not correct. It might be a guess. It might be incorrect information they've been giving out for 30 years. It might be what they think is right and seems to be the case. It might be based on their lack of belief in how exclusive breastfeeding works. We talk a lot about that in the first 100 hours. The need to understand and fully believe, have faith in the fact that exclusive breastfeeding is a viable way to feed a healthy newborn baby. It requires support and information, but it is a viable way to feed a newborn baby. And when I say that, I recognize that there's people who are going to say, yeah, of course, Christine, no duh. But there's also people who are going to hear that and think, I don't know, I've never seen it work. I worry about it every time, and that's why I say what I say. And we do see that, in communities, in different places, we see where there are people who simply don't trust that breastfeeding works. And now that tools are so much more available, especially breast pumps, it's very easy to put that little tiny seed of doubt, like, well, maybe you should just pump and bottle feed so that we know, so that we have this extra data, so that we have this visible thing, because I don't believe in invisible stuff like exclusive breastfeeding. So you can see how that information and how those doubts can really creep in and start to increase anxiety when babies are getting medical care or medical checkups in places where there really isn't anyone there who's providing lactation support that's appropriate to the baby's age, who's able to assess what's going on, who's able to talk to a mother through whatever issues and questions she might be having. That really can be a problem. And our final clinical barrier, we're going to talk about another situation which is unfortunate and difficult to talk about, but there are plenty of people in different fields which are providing information about lactation and providing what they call lactation support, who may have had some basic lactation training, but who may have too much ego to understand what they don't know, or they simply haven't had enough lactation training to understand that they're missing red flags and they're not making referrals for babies and mothers who really need to be seen by a clinically trained IBCLC. So if you find that the support that you give tends to revolve around things like, well, just keep trying, or no, it's supposed to hurt for a while and then it'll get better, or it seems to always end in the recommendation for, well, maybe you actually should try pumping, or maybe your baby needs a little bit of formula just to get through this. If those tend to be the outcomes that you find yourself leading to with your clients and patients, it could be that you are lacking some additional information about lactation. Again, I fully recognize that we have documented research that shows a lack of formalized training for medical professionals. And we also know that there's a big range of how much training in lactation is required for lots of other related folks, lots of other people who are involved in birth work and postpartum care. So if you have any doubts about the lactation information and your capacity to provide lactation support, I highly recommend that you think about getting some additional training and talking to some more experienced folks just to make sure that you really are giving out the best information. Because when people are in those earliest hours and days of breastfeeding and lactation, bad information or insufficient information, a lack of assessment, a lack of observation, and truly a lack of trust and understanding in how exclusive breastfeeding works, these things can destroy the ability of somebody to exclusively breastfeed. They can fully tear it down. So if we expect that we are ever going to make the needle move on helping people to be able to exclusively breastfeed longer and increase those exclusive breastfeeding rates in this country, we are going to have to get real, and people have to take personal responsibility for this. It feels terrible to say that, to understand that people are paying for and investing their time in formal education to become physicians, to become nurses, to become midwives, to become doulas, to become any kind of postpartum care specialist, and not getting all the lactation information. I mean, it should be baked in. I get that. I fully get that. It should definitely be. That just seems so wrong that it's not there. But the truth is that it's just not always there. And that doesn't mean that every single doctor is lacking the information, or every single midwife, or every single postpartum care specialist. Not at all. There's plenty of examples of people who are well trained and know what they're doing, but there are also plenty of examples where people just don't know that there's so much more to it, or they've never had the opportunity to work through things with an instructor or a mentor who can help them get through their lack of trust in exclusive breastfeeding. Because part of it is that. Part of it is moving past biases. And you can't just say, well, this is how it works. You have to believe that. That's not quite how that works. You have to really work around people's built-in beliefs and their personal lived experiences and what they've seen professionally over however long they've been practicing. And that takes some time, it takes some effort. But there's definitely opportunities for that. One of the opportunities that I offer is it's a really timely conversation, because right now, the First 100 Hours Masterclass, which is a full course in how to apply strategic information and techniques to the first hours and days of breastfeeding to ensure that people have every chance possible to be able to exclusively breastfeed without getting interrupted by focusing on the wrong things or doubts, people's lack of trust in breastfeeding, or a lack of support. We really want to make sure that we're setting up these environments where people are supported to actually exclusively breastfeed. If they choose not to, great, go on your way. But we need to make sure that they have the opportunity to do so. And too many of the things that we're seeing are getting in the way. One quick example here is recently we received a message through our helpline where somebody relayed her situation. Her baby had been born 2 weeks to the day before the call came in and currently weighed 2 ounces more than they did at birth. So they had dropped a few days later, and now they weighed 2 ounces more than their birth weight at 14 days of age. And they knew that because today had been the day that they went to the doctor and had that 2-week checkup with the pediatrician. So a lot of you are saying, great, what were they calling you about? And some of you are saying, okay, well, so what's the question here? Well, the question was, the pediatrician said, I'd really like the baby to gain more. You need to start pumping and giving the baby a couple of bottles a day so that they can gain more. And so after hearing that, some of you are saying, that's outrageous, while others are saying, yeah, I could see why that might be a good idea. And I would encourage you to think about how quickly the answer or the response to that came up for you. Think about what it means to have those instantaneous feelings about the scenario when it's described to you. What is your gut reaction when somebody describes a scenario where you don't have a lot of information, right? Where does that lead you? Because a lot of that is going to tell you a great deal about how much information you really know, how much you are really just digging your heels in about, and how much you might need to consider what you would do in that situation if you were the person hearing that scenario being described to you by the mother. If she was sitting in front of you asking you that question, what do I do now? Because I have been exclusively breastfeeding. I don't want to introduce a bottle. I don't really want to pump right now. What should I do? What would you say? Where would you take that? How would you help her? Knowing whatever you currently know, do you feel like you need more information in order to be able to answer that question from the mother? Do you feel like you need more information about how lactation works in order to know what the answer to that question would be? There's a lot there. There's a lot of things to think about there. And your gut reaction should be telling you where you can take what you do next about deciding if you are a person who might need information like what we talk about in the First 100 Hours Masterclass. The class is set up to be as simple as it can be for you to accomplish it and achieve it. The videos are short. The videos are also available as audio in case you prefer listening, or you like to watch and listen, or however you like to learn. It's there. And there are many, many types of explanations, case studies, scenarios that are explained to you. Plus, between now and the end of the year, the end of 2025, I'm going to be meeting with everybody who's in the class once a week, have live Q&A, talk through case studies, talk through feedback about the program, talk through whatever's coming up as this information starts to percolate in your brain, because it's not always easy to integrate with what you already know or what you were thinking. I mean, one example I can think of is that, if you're listening to this and your primary education or training and service that you offer to parents is really around infant sleep, you might find the information in this pretty difficult to integrate with what you feel that you know right now. If you are, for instance, a doula who already provides a lot of lactation support, you might hear things in here and think to yourself, well, that explains a lot about why when I'm seeing my clients at home after they've come home from the hospital, they're telling me this. So, there's just a lot of things you're going to be able to work through and sort of figure out. And I want to make sure that I'm there for you to sort of sit and talk it all through. And there's also, of course, the opportunity that if you're thinking right now, I might need that, but I really don't want anybody else to know that I'm doing this. It's a completely private course. No one will know that you are taking the course. There's no part where you have to show up or your name appears anywhere. It's all completely private if you want it to be. And if you have questions and you don't want to be part of the Zoom sessions, there's no requirement, but you can email your questions to me and you can get a private answer, or I can answer the question without naming you during the call, which are going to be recorded, and then you'll be able to listen to it on that. I mean, this is a private way to learn. So if you really want this information, you want to make it through getting all of this information, but you honestly don't want anyone else to know about it, that's completely fine and completely possible. So I hope that this conversation about clinical barriers to breastfeeding kind of opened up how you're thinking about things, and that you feel like there is something that you can do about the proliferation of misinformation that's going on, about the lack of fundamental lactation support that's happening, because maybe you're in a role or a situation where you can help those around you in the hospital or facility where you work. Maybe you can encourage them to get the training that they need. Maybe you heard something I said about the use of tools to mask problems, and it triggered a thought for you that is something new that you can say, something new that you can explain to families. Maybe you thought about those pediatrician visits and those clinic visits, and it gave you an idea for how something could be improved in the one where you work or something in your community. Maybe it, reminded you that not all of us have the same level of, training, and some people have less and some people have more. And there's always information that we can share throughout the whole network that's going to help. And if you have an idea for how, to get information out, obviously this is a podcast and that's one of the things that I do, but there are always other ways to be communicating things that you know, things that you find out, things that you read in journal articles, sharing those amongst the whole network of people who are impacting pregnant and breastfeeding patients. So hopefully it triggered something for you that you want to take action on. And if the action that you want to take is to look a little bit more into the First 100 Hours Masterclass, obviously I'll put the link in the show notes for you. You can click on that and get more information about it. If you complete the course before December 28th, you can earn CERPs. And you need CERPs if you are a recertifying IBCLC. No one else needs CERPs. If you are a student and you are planning and preparing to apply for the IBCLC exam, you know already likely that you need 95 hours of lactation-specific education. This could be part of your 95 hours. It's an 8-hour course. So for those who are earning CERPs, it's 8 hours, 8 CERPs. But if you don't need CERPs, that's okay. The deadline is there for the CERPs, but the class is not going away. It will still be available. I'd love to have you in it now though, because I do have those live sessions that are planned from now, between now and December 19th, because like I said, I really want to be there to make sure that you're able to integrate the information as you're taking it in. So yeah, if you are thinking about that, the link will be in the show notes, and I really look forward to hearing from you if there's anything that I can answer, any way that I can help. And I look forward to our next time together here on the podcast. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Evolve Lactation Podcast. If today's conversation sparked something in you, whether it's a new strategy you want to try, a policy you want to challenge, or simply the reminder that you're not alone in this work, take that energy and run with it. Remember, real change happens when committed professionals like you have the resources and community support to act. Join my community at evolvelactation.org for ongoing discussions, exclusive free resources, and connection with other people who are doing this important work alongside you. You can find all the links in the show notes and connect with me on Substack or LinkedIn for more insights and updates. Whether you're just starting your lactation journey or you've been advocating for families for years, your voice matters. Your expertise matters. And together, we're not just evolving our individual practice, we're transforming the entire system. Until next time, keep evolving.